You were hired by an airline consortium to improve the perception of air travel. You have 1 year and a budget of $10 million. What are you going to do? Welcome everyone to another mock interview with Exponent. Today we're here with Ashish. Would you like to introduce yourself before we get started?
Hey all, my name is Ashish Shah, a PM at Google for the past 8 years. Incredibly fortunate to have worked with on a variety of products, starting with like semiconductors outside of Google, all the way to developer APIs for augmented reality, and lately worked on like growth of products such as Google Lens. So yeah, excited to do this interview.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here with us. So my question for you today is in the product sense and strategy category. You were hired by an airline consortium to improve the perception of air travel. You have 1 year and a budget of $10 million. What are you going to do?
All right. Certainly like very pertinent. I just had uh, a less than stellar travel experience myself. So, uh, all right. So let me actually just make sure I understood the question correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So I am hired by a travel consortium,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea is to improve the travel experience.
Yes.
Okay, and you mentioned I have $10 million in uh, that I could actually spend towards this. So a couple of like clarifying questions, if that's okay right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the consortium, I'm imagining this consists of like the airlines and the airports. Um, are there any other any other players that I should consider in part of this consortium, just so I know what value we are looking for
So
from this?
I'll kind of I'll say that. How about you tell me if you think that any other stakeholders need to be a part of this, and I can tell you whether or not they are.
I think there could be, I believe a lot of the employees at airlines
Mm-hmm.
actually come from private contractors and maybe also
Mm.
unions. So that could be one other like set of players we could consider in the consortium. But like from a commercial point of view, it's largely, I would imagine it's the airlines and the airports. We can focus there. And like I'll keep that at the back of my mind that there might be some other players involved in this as well.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I can like bring in their perspective from their side if and
Yeah,
when that's pertinent.
I think that
Sounds
sounds good.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned that uh, this is to improve the overall the air travel experience. So the air travel experience obviously is like a multi-staged experience,
Mm-hmm.
starting with like discovery of like how you discover what place to go to if you are in the process
Mm-hmm.
of like discovery, booking, then the preparing for travel, uh, and the airport experience, the boarding experience, the travel experience, the deboarding and deplaning experience, and like
Yeah.
getting your luggage and getting out. So it's a fairly like broad journey. Uh, is there any particular area I should focus on, or like or should I pick one that makes sense or feels like most painful and ripe for like disruption?
I'm interested in seeing what you would pick.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Um, and you mentioned that this is like very specific ask on like a budget of like $10 million.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, $10 million for like an air travel experience and a year doesn't seem like a very large budget. So I'm imagining like we can scope this to the point of like, okay, this is largely a pilot project that we can learn from,
Mm-hmm.
and if that's successful, we can basically scale out there. So if we can actually focus it on a pilot, then I can actually keep aside like at least like keep the constraints around like scaling at bay for a little
Mm.
bit if that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good assumption to make.
Okay. Awesome. With those questions out of the way, let me take a few minutes to just get my thoughts
Sure.
together.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's actually the way in terms of like a roadmap of how I would tackle this is like we broadly know that what the goal is, um, and that improve the travel experience, and we'll actually define that as we go forward.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about who the users are in this that we are trying to improve this for, um, what their pain points might be, um, and we'll have to like figure out a way to prioritize who the users are going to be, and based on those users, what pain points we'll solve for. So this comes back to like what part of the experience should we actually be tackling, and then we can think through some solutions. And once we have some solutions, we can figure out like what makes sense within this timeline of like a 10 million, a timeline of a year and $10 million. We can pick one. We can figure out a way how we are actually going to run the pilot, how we're going to measure things, because like with the pilot, the most important thing is we actually want to take away some key learnings that we can apply back to coming up with a real solution that we would deploy. So we'll go forward in that way, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So give me a minute to think about like who the users in this might be.
Sure.
All right. So broadly speaking, it's going to be like we can think of travelers and we can think of staff. I mean, in the staff, you can actually sub-segment, but there's basically travelers and staff and the staff experience. The real commercial value, I believe, and the real disruption that can possibly happen for the benefit of the users is going to be in the traveler segment. I'm just going to hone in on that from like whatever I design perspective. Again, in terms of like the air travel experience, I'm imagining this consortium. I'm going to make an assumption that this consortium is based out in the US. And is that fair?
Sure, that's a fine assumption to make.
Okay, and I think given the budget and timeline constraints, I'm going to focus on the US market to begin with, and we can think of like scaling post that. But in terms of like we think of like the just the US travel industry in this case, we can further segment that into number one is like broadly into like, okay, there are short flights and there are like long flights. So long flights, I'm imagining like the coast to coast kind of flights, or any flights which are like say greater than like 4 hours.
Okay.
And the shorter ones are less than 4 hours, just for starters. And the reason why I think we should actually figure out what we're going to go after is the kind of problems people have across these two segments is very different. Because if you're on a longer flight, just amortized, you're spending less time at the airport and more time in the flight. And in a shorter flight, you're spending more time at the airport and less time on the flight. So there's like this overhead of like the airport cost or the friction. And so I think it's important that we tackle one over the other. My hunch tells me that we should start with the shorter term flights, and I'll tell you why. Number one is that people have options when it comes to short flights. People can drive. People in places where there's like railways, very few places in the US, but there are like things you can take an Amtrak as an example, or you could take a Greyhound. So there are options for people to go from like one place to another, maybe like not over 4 hours, but for a 4-hour flight. But at least if I want to go from like where I am in San Jose to LA, I have options of like driving as an example. Unfortunately, with like the longer flights, there are fewer options, and kind of like, I hate to say this, but like travelers are kind of stuck. There's like really not much there's not much they can do. So I'm imagining like from the consortium's perspective, if they want to unlock commercial value, is it like from the airport's perspective, they want like more flights to come into their airport, more frequent flights. Airlines obviously want more passengers to fly. And I think the long distance market is kind of captive in many ways.
That's fair.
And so the shorter distance flights are where I think there is like a bit more commercial value. And again, I'm actually putting on the optics of like just, okay, a consortium is driven by commercial intent in this case, not by public good. And so I'm going to focus there, if that's okay by you.
I think that sounds good.
Awesome. All right. So now that we've actually talked about, we're going to be US focused, short flights, and we're going to focus mainly on the travelers. So give me a moment to think through what might be the main pain points I want to solve for.
Sure.
Give me like a minute here. Okay. So I think the thing with travel is like a common theme you'll find in here is that it's one of those things where you basically have no control over your destiny on what happens when you travel. Uh, I mean, especially for large parts of it in a shorter flight uh, when a majority of your time is going to be spent at the airport, or a large part of your time is going to be spent at the airport. There is really not much you can actually do to actually make your experience. It's not like I can actually decide that I'm going to pay $50 extra and I'm going to have a better experience, at least at the airport. There are certain pockets where you could actually do that at the airport. Like, for example, you could have like the clear pass or the fast pass that you can actually breeze to security. But there are parts of the experience where really you're kind of stuck with what's there. And I think I'm naturally gravitating towards those areas where people are just like lost in terms of like they just don't have control over like how their experience is going to be. No amount of like money, or it's just sheer willpower that people will like breeze through it. And so there's really nothing they could do, and I think that's a part that we could actually think about. So in terms of like if you look at how somebody would travel, the first thing is like you book a flight, plenty of options, and like I think there's plenty of choice out there in terms of how you book. It's a relatively low friction process. And then you prep for the flight. Again, depends on you. There's really not much friction that's the consortium can actually solve for.
Yeah.
Then you head over to the airport. Again, you're plenty covered with like shuttles and taxis and such. Then you end up at an airport. I think that's where the stress begins to peak. And this is where, like, for example, like what do you do when you go to the airport? The first thing is you park your car, you start lugging your baggage over to a baggage claim. God forbid, if it's a long weekend, you're going to be like in the 99th person in a line waiting to get your turn. Even worse if you're traveling with kids. So I think that's where the stress actually begins, and people tend to expect the worst of what's going to come out of that. And I do also think that from my experience, there is when people expect the worst at what's going to happen at the check-in, they tend to like over prepare. And so they leave like several hours in advance when they could basically just leave like an hour in advance. They'll reach like 3 hours in advance when really it's not required because they just want to make sure they're covered. And so I think there's a lot of like tax you pay because of that fear. So I think that's one hotspot I feel in that journey. Things go fine. You get you check in your luggage. Hopefully you're not over the baggage allowance, and you don't have to like reshuffle bags and things. Then you go to security. And security, again, it's a hit or miss depending on like the day and the number of like security officers you might have. You might actually be waiting in line for like half an hour, or you might actually be a breeze through. But there are options in there. If people pay, they can actually get the fast verification and like breeze through it. But for most majority of people, it's a fairly like frictionful experience or an uncertain experience. And then you basically go to the boarding area, you walk over to the boarding area and then wait. And then you board the plane. And once you're in the plane, it's basically you kind of like you're primed for that experience. There's really not much, like you've come to expect that this is when I'm going to be in a plane, I'm going to be in one seat for like X number of hours, and this is how it's going to be. So I think just mentally people are much more primed at what that experience might be inside the flight. And also in here, they also have options. Is that if they really want a comfortable experience, they could always go fly business class or first class. So there is some amount of like leverage that they have over the experience. And then once you're on the plane, you fly, you get out, you walk over to baggage claim, collect your baggage. In here, again, you have a less of an agency or like leverage on how that experience might be in collecting baggage and such. So that's roughly how I actually would map out the user journey.
Okay.
And the hotspots that seem to be like the hotspots I feel are most ripe for solving are the ones around like the check-in experience, and the luggage retrieval experience.
Okay.
And the way I would actually and the way, like, just to formalize how I'd actually think about like these hotspots is a couple of rubrics in this. How severe is this pain point? Uh, the second one is like, are there options out there that can make this pain point like go away, or make this like experience a lot more deterministic?
Okay.
And yeah, sorry, go
So
ahead.
I have a question, but keep going with your criteria if you have some more.
So I think these are the two main ones.
Yeah.
Happy to answer any
Sure.
question that you might have.
So one question I have for you is, let's say it doesn't need to be a very long deep dive into this, but let's say you had picked the longer flight category. How would that affect your choice of pain points to prioritize?
Yeah, with longer flights, I would actually again, like the idea of like, where is it that I don't have leverage on the experience by paying money doesn't change a lot. But on longer flights, you're spending a lot more time on the flight, and so I think the severity of the pain point is actually higher, probably uh, during the flight,
Okay.
during the flight time. And so there would be like, if that was the thing I would gravitate towards there, is like, how do you actually improve the flying experience? Um, One specifically, like on long flights, after you actually hauled yourself and your family across the board like cattle for like 6 hours, and then you basically wait for 45 minutes to deplane. And I think that's probably one of the most frustrating experiences, because the plane has landed, everything is like set to go, but like people are going out like but it's like a very inefficient way in which like people are being led out. And
Yeah.
to me, like, those are the parts of the experience that I think they are bad, but they don't need to be so bad.
Okay.
And I think
All right.
there is so I might still focus on like the check-in and the baggage claim experience. But I think at some point in time, for the longer the flights are, I feel like the votes for like going towards improving an in-flight experience and like a deplaning experience might actually start rising.
Got it. Okay. That sounds good. Thank you. You can continue.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to focus on like uh, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on like the check-in experience.
Sure.
And I think we can actually, so we talked about users who are travelers for short distances. I would actually further refine this and say that what even sub-segment of these travelers is this most critical for. So there are like people traveling with their families, people traveling on business,
Yeah.
or people are individual travelers. And I feel like the business travelers have a lot more options. They might actually have access to like clear pass and things of those sorts, so they might actually be able to breeze through. They might be traveling light, and so the check-in experience may not be that hard. The individual travelers, again, might be traveling light, so the check-in experience might not be as hard for them.
Yeah.
And they don't have as many options. Like the individual travelers are unlikely to like drive 4 hours on their own. And but for a family, like if you're a family of four, then you have a choice. You can always take a car. And so I think that's probably like the family segment is where I'd actually go after. Again, in the interest of like being super narrow in terms of segment, given the timeline constraints.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
Awesome. So we talked about users. We talked about the pain point of like checking in and how to make that a lot more deterministic and one that people feel like they have like control over. And then we can actually move on to like what possible solutions could we design for this. So give me a second, a couple of
Sure.
seconds to think through this. All right, so I'm thinking of like given thinking of like two things in here in terms of like how where could we run possible pilots as solutions. Um, One would be what I would call like a check-in at home service. So today
Mm-hmm.
you can actually check in at home. What you cannot do is it does not take away the real problem of checking in is actually standing in line to deposit your luggage and like waiting with bated breath for somebody to find that you are like a kilogram over the
Mm-hmm.
limit and then you reshuffling the bags and such. And also like hauling those bags all the way from home to the airport and then
Yeah.
standing in line. So that part of that check-in experience is not yet covered. Um, and so like a true check-in at home uh, would actually be in my mind like would actually be one that would really relieve some of that friction. So that's one possible solution, and we can deep dive into that. The second one could be a halfway between like where we are today and a check-in at home, and that would be like a concierge service, but a bit more deterministic in that you could basically like book an appointment
Mm-hmm.
is like an hour before my flight. I will drop off my luggage. So it is not like I have to go 3 hours before and wait for my turn. It's basically
Mm.
there's an appointment and you drop off your luggage at the concierge at the airport, obviously, at a determined time that's convenient to you.
Okay.
So these are the two possible uh, service solutions that I could think of that could be piloted within a year. And I'm generally gravitating towards a more aggressive one of this pickup at home because to some degree, like concierge or drop off at the curbside exists today. And
Mm-hmm.
like if we really want to create a step function in the experience, I think something like pickup at home or a true check-in at home might be worth exploring. So that's where I'm gravitating towards, and we can actually deep dive into what that would look like from like a user journey. But I want to like pause there for a second and see if you had like any questions.
One question that comes to mind is, let's say you had picked, and kind of similar to what I had asked before, let's say you had picked one of the other subcategories of users that you just identified, right? Like within travelers on a short flight, there could be families, there could be individuals, etc. Let's say you picked another one of those categories. Would that affect your choice of solutions here?
Yeah, so I think I would say actually then rather than say like I would pick a different solution, I would actually pick a different pain point
Okay, I
in
see.
those cases. So for example, if it was a business traveler,
Mm-hmm.
um, in that case, I may not have actually picked in check-in as like the pain point because I would say 80% of them actually do not check in a lot of luggage for short flights because they're
Okay.
probably going for like a day or two for a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And in there, I actually would have uh, figured out like a different pain point. I'd have to think about like where
That's
I think
fine. Yeah.
in their travel journey, what their hotspot might be.
Okay.
And I think it's about like making them more productive uh, in while they're waiting to board or such. Could have been like a pain point, and
Okay.
the solution would have been entirely different. It would not have been one of these two.
Got it. Okay. That's fine. Thank you.
All right. So I'm gonna. So what would this pick up at home solution look like? And so it would be that when you check in for an experience, um, and whenever you're actually checking in as a family, because we're actually going to go after families. If you're a family of like three or four, automatically you'll be popped up an option
Mm-hmm.
saying that would you like to take part in this pilot of having like your bags picked up at home,
Hmm.
weighed at home, screened at home, and so that you are basically just traveling with your hand luggage.
Yeah.
And for X of say $100, you could participate in this. And this would only be again like this. The good thing about like targeting families and short flights is that you could actually easily determine this. Is that if somebody is going from San Jose to LAX, short flight, so check mark number one,
Mm-hmm.
family of four trying to check in. And so, and they'll say that how many bags they have as well in the check-in process. So you
Mm-hmm.
can automatically like pre-select them for the pilot. And so that's a nice thing about like being that narrow, is that you can be really precise on where you offer that pilot. And so if the users agree that, yeah, they want to do that, what would happen is that they would basically get like a couple of time slots that they can choose from
Mm-hmm.
when probably like a day before their travel or the day of travel, depending on the time of travel that they have, is that there would be an airport service that would pick up their luggage, and they would weigh it using like official measurements, and say whether things are fine or not. As far as I know, like things you don't actually screen at US airports, the
Mm-hmm.
luggage, even when you actually do the check-in. So I think
Yeah.
you don't have to worry about like running this to an X-ray machine. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
While in like other places I've visited, like they also screen bags, check bags, while you're checking in. So I'm glad we actually picked the US market in this case.
Yeah.
It's in some ways it's easier. And so they wait, and if anything is over the weight, you can actually change it at the comfort of your home, and the bags would be hauled away to the airport and like checked in. And so you walk into the airport. Now you're fully checked in. You have your boarding passes. All you have to go do is like walk through security
Mm-hmm.
and board your plane. So now you actually don't need to have like this. I'm going to have like this 3 hour buffer because I'm just not sure how bad the check-in experience is going to be. So you can
Mm-hmm.
actually like just walk into the airport and walk over to security and hopefully like breeze through it.
Got it.
And hopefully, if you are like a clear pass, you can actually really breeze to security. So you could be like from your house door to the plane's door. It could be in a matter of like an hour, as an example,
Got it.
compared to like these 3 hours that you spend. Um, and so now, in a short flight, you've actually really cut down this overhead significantly
Mm-hmm.
with something like this. So that is how like roughly the service would look like. Obviously, like lots of like possibilities of like innovating on this service in here. Um, you could partner with like the likes of Ubers and the Lyfts. Like they have Uber Eats. You could now that pick up passengers. Now they can actually be contracted to pick up luggage. Or
Mm-hmm.
when you have like airport shuttles, and you could have those actually also be retrofitted, those services. So that's like more business for like those folks as well. And this is where I think that is actually the consortium could actually expand, because now we're actually spreading the value over to like other players, which is always nice.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it's a rising tide is going to lift all the boats in that case. So there's a possibility to actually also involve those folks in the mix at that point in time.
Yeah.
Obviously, like I'm glossing over a lot of details in here. Things that could possibly go wrong in here is what if I decided that I forgot to like pack in something,
Mm.
and now like, I'm stuck. Like what if there's like a liquid I needed to pack, but now I'm stuck because I can't just carry it because I can't carry it in my carry-on.
Yeah.
The logistics of actually uh, hauling somebody's luggage over and doing that in a secure way is obviously something that requires thought.
Mm-hmm.
Willy-nilly, I don't want to hand over my luggage with valuables to anybody who like pops up at my door, even if they claim that they are from the airport. So I think there's
Mm-hmm.
some trust that needs to be built into the system as well. But again, like these are not insurmountable problems in my mind.
That's fair.
We could get over those. Um, yeah, so that's how I'd go to market. And the way to measure this is that at the end of you'd probably do a CSAT survey. And the kind of questions are your scale of 1 to 5, how would you recommend this experience? Also gives you a gauge of like what's the price sensitivity to
Mm-hmm.
something like this. I charge $100, but maybe you could run some experiments in different parts of the US where one's $100, one is $75, and you figure out like what's the propensity to pay
Yeah.
in this. And you could ask questions around like how much time did you save in a survey as well. So I think there's lots to learn from that pilot. And if it's successful, then you can actually start figuring out how do you actually expand that. Maybe even for slightly medium range flights as well.
Mm.
At that point in time, more airports, more geographies, more participating airlines, more airports, and such. Yeah, so that's roughly how I'd actually go to market and measure with this. Any And that's really all I had. Any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I had one last question for you. This was more on the product design portion of what you just addressed. So you described sort of the user journey for this particular experience, right? I'm curious where, at a high level, what do you think the experience would look like when there is not a successful passing of all the criteria for a person's luggage? So people have come to your home, you've booked a time, they've checked your luggage. Maybe the size doesn't work, or maybe the weight is not right. How do you think you would deal with those kind of situations?
I see. So, given this is at your, just to understand the question, what happens when, specifically, what happens if you signed up for the service,
Hmm.
somebody came to your doorstep, but they are not able to fulfill their promise?
Yes, exactly.
Uh, and so, I think there are a couple of, so what could be the reasons they could not fulfill the promise, which are outside the user's control? So, for example, if your bags are packed overweight, you have
Hmm.
the option to pay, or you have the option of actually shuffling around your luggage into
Okay.
your hand baggage. So again, the user is in control
Okay.
in some of these. There could be like unfortunate situations where your bag is like a weird shape or
Yeah.
size that doesn't fit into like somebody's trunk.
Yeah. Or
So they could,
guidelines, airline guidelines are just all over the place for what size baggage sometimes they allow and sometimes they don't.
yeah, and that could be, but I think that one is easier to be done, relatively speaking,
Hmm.
because I'm imagining like the check-in experience check in. When you check in, you basically say uh, there's a way to say that your bag should be yay size and yay size big, and
Hmm.
like this much should be the weight. So there's like very clear objective guidelines
Hmm.
towards that. For example, if you're shipping like your golf kit, there are certain like restrictions on what you could do, like what that dimensions could be and such. So I think you can be a bit more forthcoming
Okay.
about that. Um, the thing is, like, there could be a design challenge in here is that because it's a consortium, every airline might actually have different, uh, different messaging. So it can get confusing. Um, so I think it is again like all the more reason you actually want to go narrow first and try
Hmm.
maybe only with like two airlines with like similar-ish criteria. Also, the good thing is the check-in experience happens generally from the airline website and not from like the consortium website.
Yeah.
So it's actually very tailored to that airline. So there is no level of like there is no need for like an abstraction layer that needs to be put in. But for example, if like this was a separate service run by like a consortium, now we have to like really start worrying about like how do I actually make those differences visible and actionable to
Yeah.
the for the user. um yeah,
Yeah.
but great point.
That sounds good. Okay. I think we can stop here. This was fantastic. Thank you so much, Ashish. Um, how do you feel, first of all, before I jump into some of the comments that I have?
Yeah, I think generally it went okay. I feel I could have done better at pausing a bit.
Okay.
I felt like I was like hearing myself talk a lot.
Now that's very easy to do, I think, in these, especially when you're thinking really fast and you've got ideas flowing. You just want to kind of get those out. I think in on that particular point, sure, you maybe could have paused a little bit, but I wasn't ever lost, which I think is more important. So if you wanted to pace yourself a little bit better, then maybe, yeah, whatever makes you feel comfortable. But I think the most important thing is just checking in with the interviewer and making sure that they know where you're at, and if they have any questions, which I think you did a couple of times, which was good. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing I thought I actually vacillated a bit between like users and pain points. And so there was
Mm,
no like so I talked about users, I'm going to go with travelers, but maybe that was the opportunity where I could have like subdivided that segment earlier into like families and such
yeah.
before going into the pain points. But I'm on the fence on that because I think the pain points helped me actually think through like what that other
Yeah.
user segment might be. But uh, probably one area where I could have been a bit clearer.
To be honest, I think that that's totally fine. I feel like whatever the whatever provides for the best logical flow is the best framework to go with. So if that means moving some things around or kind of going back to something that you had talked about before, not in a, oh, I changed my mind, actually, this is, if you're going to do that, then just be very clear that I'm changing my mind because X, Y, Z. And in this case, you said, okay, I'm going back and I'm going to resegment because X, Y, Z. And you told me exactly why you were doing it. So I don't think that's a problem. In fact, I wrote that down as point of feedback, positive feedback, that if you really think that that's going to help your argument down the line, do it. Just be very clear about why you're doing it and take the interviewer along with you in that process. The other thing I think was pretty good was making sure that your pain points are specific to a category. I think that's why I asked you those two questions that, would you change anything about your pain points or about your solutions that you've proposed based on the category? Sometimes that's not totally clear, but you had answers to that when I asked. So that's really important. I say one of the biggest litmus tests, I think, for these product sense questions is if your pain points or solutions are super generic to any user category, you haven't gone deep enough in thinking about why you're making those choices. I thought the flow of the interview was really good. It was very conversational and just flow of thought was easy to follow. And sometimes I think these can fall into the trap of being very formulaic, which I don't think this was. So that was well done. And then
Thanks.
I really enjoyed the point about you mentioned this briefly at the end about bringing in services like Uber as part of the strategic approach to go to market. And I think that was it's things like that really set the second half of these kinds of interviews apart. Can you think creatively out of the box? And something like that, I mean, it's not revolutionary, but it's not a connection that everyone makes. And it's showing that you're thinking about, okay, well, how can you cut costs over here? Do we have to have our own cars to go around and do this process for people? Or can we actually use the advantage of having a big consortium of people to forge bonds with other companies in the market? You preemptively thought of the challenges, which a lot of times I feel like in these interviews I have to ask, okay, what do you think the challenges are going to be? It's not a deal breaker. That doesn't mean that you're not going to pass the interview, but I think it shows foresight when you just preempt the interviewer with telling them what the challenges are going to be. And the same thing with measuring success as well. That's a big part of the product development journey. So being able to call that out initially and preempting any questions from the interviewer on how you're going to be able to tell whether your product is achieving the goal that you set for yourself right at the beginning is really important. So those are the main pieces of feedback I had. And overall, I thought this was well thought out, very easy to follow, and led to an interesting solution at the end.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ashish. Do you have any advice for anyone else who's going to face a question like this?
I think number one, number two, and number three, practice.
Yeah.
It is really, really hard to think on your feet, especially when you're doing a real interview.
Yeah.
So prime yourself by doing like a dozen mock interviews before you actually step into a real one, because it stops feeling like, I imagine, like when I started doing my mock interviews, the first 10 were like, it really felt like a chore. And then it started becoming more and more natural. And when I was interviewing, it actually just felt like fun at
Yeah.
that point in time, and it didn't feel as hard. So practice. And one thing I'd actually say is at the beginning, like just lay out your framework, not just to show that you actually think logically, but also to make a mental note of like all the things that you want to cover. Because once you go into a flow, it's very easy to actually forget that, now I had to like talk about measurements. But when I have like it written right down in front of me in my roadmap, which I just even articulate to you, it's going to be much harder to forget.
Yeah.
And it comes across a lot more like buttoned up in the flow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the key things that, at least when I'm interviewing people, that I look for is, are you leading the interview or am I leading the interview? And that's a very, very important distinction to make. If I feel like I'm leading the interview, there's a doubt planted in my mind of, okay, can you then handle the job of a PM outside of the constraints of an interview environment? Because that's a lot more ambiguity over there. So if you're leading the interview, it's a lot more reassuring for me on the other side that, great, you're taking me through the journey. I can pitch in whenever I want to, and if I think that something needs clarifying. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much, Ashish. This was fantastic. It was great having you with us, and I'm sure this is going to be very valuable for people watching at home. Thanks very much, and good luck with your interviews.
Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons below to let us know that this video was valuable for you. And of course, check out hundreds more videos just like this at tryexponent.com. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your upcoming interview.